Thank you all for coming today. Uh, I appreciate the invitation to come back to Institute for World Politics, which was new to me when I first came here in January, and since then I've had a chance to get to know some of you, people on the staff, and teachers and students, former students, and I've been very impressed with what you're doing and what the mission is. So when Mac and I started talking about coming back here and speaking to you, it seemed rather natural fit that the Cold War, of which we're all, at least Mac and I speak for us, Cold War generation people, that should be the topic of today's speech. So I'll keep it tight. I really want to just share with you almost novelistic impressions rather than give you a lecture on Reagan-era Pershing missile foreign policy and the things that triggered the end of the Cold War. And I will do this with three sort of vignettes from my life. I was, at this time, the music critic of Time magazine, which in the last days of what we call the Raj there, we still had enormous budgets for our writers, and those of us who wrote the premier back of the book sections were almost always on an airplane to somewhere, Japan or China or Germany or, in my case, Russia. So it gave us an unparalleled glimpse with the power of what was then America's foremost journalistic organization, next perhaps the New York Times, to go places that we wouldn't have gone, obviously, as civilians, and see things that we wouldn't have seen if we were tourists. So these are three episodes from that particular period. And I want to tie this in with the mission of the school here, too, which is talking about foreign policy and what's important about foreign policy and what should animate our foreign policy. And I'll bring that up at the end. So let me begin with an impression. In 1985, in February of 1985, it was the 300th anniversary of the birth of Bach and Handel, who were each born in 1685. And were exact contemporaries. Handel died a few years after Bach, but not many. They had been born in what was East Germany in 1985. Bach lived his entire life in East Germany. He never ventured to what would later become West Germany. And so I went to my editor and I said, instead of just writing the usual sort of appreciation piece about is it Bach great and is it Handel great, why don't I go to the East Germany and see where they were from? I'm a great believer in both journalistic things and literary things to go to where you want to write about. You can always tell when a novelist hasn't been to where you've been when he describes it and it's not anything like what you know. So you try to avoid that trap because there's always someone who's actually from whatever obscure place in Canada that you've decided to set your story, and then they tell you that there's not a barn on that corner or there are two streetlights, not one. So I decided, let's go back to East Germany and see what land created these two musical geniuses. So the purpose of my trip was not political. It was journalistic and it was musical as it started. Duly, I contacted the East German Presseamt by phone from my apartment in New York, and we worked out the visa details, etc., and they got a press card for me. But they informed me that I would need a translator. And I said, we're having this conversation in German. I really don't need a translator. But they said, yes, you do. So I got one. And he turned out to be a young East German, about the same age as me, mid-30s. I was 34 at the time, 35, something like that. And we actually became quite good friends. His mission was to, of course, spy on me and to record what I was saying, if possible, and just generally make sure I was politically reliable, or apolitically reliable in this case. And he took me all over the country. We went to Weimar, which is where much of the great music of Germany had been composed. We went to Eisenach, where Bach was born. We went to Halle and Erfurt, where Handel worked. Many of these cities were also what the Germans call Lutherstädte, the Lutheran cities, particularly Eisleben, where Luther was both born and died. So as our trip evolved, I began to get interested in now not just a musical background, but the religious background, and what was the animating principle. And as a novelist, I always go and I look at, I try to look at the landscape through the eyes of your character. So even as a nonfiction writer, you have characters. So Saxony, for example, was a very interesting place because it's very flat. It's like Kansas. It's not the Thuringian Schwarzwald. It's not the Black Forest. It's not the Erzgebirge. It's not the Harz Mountains. It's just a big old flat plain, and this is where Wagner was from, and Schumann as well. So I began to imbibe the spirit of the land after I went through Checkpoint Charlie. So here's what happened. I flew to Berlin, and I rented a car at Tegel Airport, and I got in my car, and I drove down the Kurfürstendamm and headed towards the Zimmerstrasse, which is where Checkpoint Charlie was, and went through. And it's just like being in a John le Carré movie. It was actually kind of cool. Berlin is usually overcast, gray, cloudy, and precipitating in some form. So the grayness and the spookiness of it added to the movie-like feel of the place. You pass that sign in 4 languages that says you are leaving the American sector. I used to think it should say, abandon all hope, ye who enter here, on the other side. And you go across, and there are the Grenzpolizei, the Grepo, and they proceed to take you apart. They check your documents. They check that your picture matches you. They look under your car. They don't really care about if you're smuggling anybody in, but they do it anyway, just to let you know who's in charge. And I didn't bring a map with me. I'm a pretty good map reader, so I tend to memorize the maps, and I didn't bring it. So I said to the guard, can you direct me, please, to the Mohrenstrasse, which is where the Presseamt was in those days, pretty close inside the wall. And he said no. So they were friendly and helpful too. And I went there and I picked up my friend Victor, my now friend Victor, and off we went on our tour. So this is what struck me. This was my first time in a communist country, a real communist country. Furthermore, the one that worked. Remember? Everyone used to say, yeah, it doesn't really work very well. But those East Germans, they're pretty good at this. Sights and sounds and smells. When you go from West Berlin to East Berlin, when you did, on the west side of the wall was a giant art mural. It was gaily graffitied, every square inch of it. So big, colorful sweeps and random sayings and quotes from musical lyrics in English, and as far as you could see, because as you go through Charlie, the wall, you kind of pass with the wall on both sides of you, so you see this. And I remember as I came up to Charlie, I saw someone had written, "Tiny purple fishes run laughing through your fingers," which is a Cream song. It's a famous song, Eric Clapton and the supergroup Cream. And I thought that's an interesting kind of sight to see. I went through, I did my thing, got my guide, and off we went. The sounds in the communist countries are quiet. The Slavic communist countries and the German communist countries, at least. I can't speak to Cuba. People talk in very, very low modulated tones or not at all. You walk into a restaurant in East Germany in those days. German restaurants are pretty quiet to begin with. You can hear a pin drop. So no one has a conversation above a whisper. You seem to have come into a giant conspiracy. Hey, Jim. Jim Garrity from National Review, my friend and colleague. Welcome. You seem to have entered a giant conspiracy in which everyone's afraid to be overheard. The reason for that, of course, was that in East Germany, in the Stasi-run East Germany, 1 out of every 3 East Germans was an informant. So if you've seen The Lives of Others, you know exactly what I'm talking about. Everyone was reporting on everyone else. So there is this hushed conspiracy. And finally, smells. I think the thing that stays with me the longest, long after my 6 years on the other side of the wall, is how badly it stinks. It doesn't stink like New York in August when there's a garbage strike. It stinks in a way that's almost metaphorical. There's the smell of the coal fires, of course, because East Germany generated electricity through what they called brown coal. There's the smell of the people, which is largely unwashed. They don't bathe very often. So, especially later when I got to the Soviet Union, it got pretty pungent there in the summertime. And there's just a general sense of desperation. Talk about quiet desperation. That's what I saw consistently in East Germany. The contrast of going from the west to the east through Charlie was so striking that every time I did it, and I did it a good number of times thereafter, it struck me as almost like going from heaven to hell. The disparity of it was that great. And as you went through Berlin, for example, it looked like in many places, in most places, that the war had ended yesterday. So, for example, when you come from Charlie and you came up the Zimmerstrasse, Friedrichstrasse, the East Germans called it Grenzeübergang Zimmerstrasse. They never called it Checkpoint Charlie. As you came up the Friedrichstrasse, you come into a district called Mitte. It's the old heart of Berlin. It's like a fist that was sticking into West Berlin. And you see a quarter that has been kind of restored, and this red brick houses, and it looked rather attractive. But it was all a Potemkin village. Almost everything about any communist Schauplatz, Schaufenster, show place, show window, was an illusion. So you got past the Rotes Rathaus, which had been this, the famous red, what's the city hall, and after that you were in a district called Prenzlauer Berg, which today is super, super chic and hot. But in those days, the buildings were still pockmarked by what the Russians had done as they came through Berlin on their way, which is right behind you now, the Brandenburger Tor and the Reichstag. So these two great monuments, the wall actually ran between them, behind the Reichstag and in front of the Brandenburg Gate. And as I drove out of Berlin, heading south towards our destinations, all the various cities that we were going to go to, starting with Eisenach, where Bach was born, you could feel it get poorer and poorer and poorer, and less filled with hope. In Germany, you can stop anywhere and have a conversation with somebody. The Germans aren't that voluble, but they will at least be polite and answer questions and give you directions. The East Germans not. And to this day, I live in Ireland most of the year now, and it's a big tourist place for East Germans, and you can still tell they're East Germans by the way they dress and how they carry themselves and how they talk. So when the tour bus pulls up in front of my local pub in Lisdoonvarna, and the Aussies get out, they're very poorly, shabbily dressed. They have no fashion sense because there wasn't any fashion to be had in their country. They talk in very low monotones, and they clump together. The one thing you don't do in an Irish pub is clump together. You interact and talk, and what we call the crack. You have to give banter and get banter in return, not the Aussies. So still 30 years now, almost, the older ones, act like they did in East Germany. And throughout this tour, through Leipzig, which looked just awful, it still was in a bad stage of disrepair, all the way to my final destination, which was Dresden, it was the same gray, ugly, hopeless, disgusting place. And I did my best to look through it because I was really trying to look back to 1685 and see what Bach saw and see what Handel saw, and go to the Thomaskirche in Leipzig, where Bach played and wrote most of the great religious works in his last period. But there was always the overlay of despair. And when I came back, about 10 days later, West Berlin never looked so good. The hookers on the Kudamm never looked so beautiful. The food was never tastier. And you just took a deep breath. And it was there that I began thinking about what our intelligence community goes through when you're posted in a place like this. And Le Carré got it very right, for example, in Spy Who Came In From the Cold. The anomie and the paranoia and the inability to contact anybody, because remember, there's no cell phones in these days. All the phones were heavily monitored. You couldn't get a call out even if you wanted to sometimes. And the fact that you were unmoored from your own surroundings, from your own supportive culture, tends to make you crazy. And crazy is what made many of our agents, as I will now tell you about in the second anecdote, which takes place in Moscow. So in the spring of 1986, I got a phone call from a man named Peter Gelb, who I've known for many, many years. He's the son of Arthur Gelb, who was the longtime sort of second in command at the New York Times for many, many, many years. And Peter was in the music business with me. He was a manager. He worked for Saul Hurok and Columbia Artist Management and really kind of made his way through the ranks. And one day he called me up at my home in New England and said, "Hey, Mike, how would you like to go to Moscow?" I said, "Yeah, cool." So that's how simple that was. And what he had done was organized a trip back to Russia for the great pianist Vladimir Horowitz, who was then an elderly man. And we knew this would be the last time that Horowitz, first time and last time he would ever go back to the Soviet Union. He had left in the early 1920s. So I went to the managing editor of Time and I said, "I'd like to go to Russia." And he said, "Great, let's make it a cover story." I was really surprised that he had not only agreed so quickly, because it was going to be an expensive trip, but that he wanted to play it up big. So we went to Russia. They went ahead of me. I took the Concorde to Paris, spent the night in Paris, and then got on a Japan Air flight to Moscow. There was a regular shuttle in those days from Paris to Moscow to Tokyo, and the good sushi restaurants, the Westerners only restaurants in Moscow, were fed by this flight from Tokyo. So it was a very valuable flight to the Western community in Russia. But we got off that morning, it was in April, 30 years ago, this month, to the news that President Reagan had bombed Libya, that he had attacked Muammar Gaddafi for the bombing of the disco in West Berlin. It was called La Belle something. I forgot exactly the name of it now. So as we got off the plane, the KGB was very, very unhappy with us and didn't really make us feel all that welcome. There was a CIA guy on the plane who was giving me the usual agency line about how this was going to be, this is the first world country, this is the other superpower. I heard this from every agency person on the other side there. And it was the US versus Russia, et cetera, and the rest of the world was sort of the third world in terms of its importance in American foreign policy, which I suppose there's some truth to that. But again, the minute you got there, your eyes, your ears, your nose was giving you a completely different message. It's dysfunctional. It doesn't work. People are lazy. People are brutal just because they can be. And for the next 2 weeks, we experienced this very, very vividly. Horowitz was staying with the American ambassador, who was then Arthur Hartman, at Spaso House, which was a big mansion in Moscow that the Siberian timber merchant had built as a home for him when he was in Moscow. And the Americans had taken it over. Well, the KGB, who obviously had many assets in the house working for the ambassador, cut the strings on the Spaso House piano, so Horowitz couldn't practice. Now, Horowitz always flew his own piano over, and that was a wonderful story all by itself, how Steinway and the head tuner at Steinway, Richard Probst, they would pack up his personal piano, which was like a hair trigger instrument, as this was an incredibly tailored instrument just for the way he played. Put it on a truck, take it to the airport, ship it diplomatic pouch to Moscow, and it would get there, and as a fact it did. But he couldn't practice, so this put him out of sorts. He was a very nervous person. He was always had stage fright, or what the Germans call Lampenfieber. So he was quite agitated, and we had started this cover story, myself and the then Time correspondent, as you know, having worked in the news service, done a lot of the interviews at his home in New York. But my job was to now take that raw material, turn it into a story, and add all of my information and my criticism and the top of the story, which would have been what happened at the concerts. So there we were. Horowitz was getting skittish. The KGB was making our life tough. You got shadowed pretty much everywhere, sometimes visibly, sometimes not. That said, I found Moscow absolutely fascinating. If I remember again, sight, sound, smells, it didn't smell as bad as East Germany. And it's gold. I hadn't realized that. My predominant impression of Moscow to this day is that it's gold. The people have the usual beat-down Soviet look to them, although the Russians are much more friendly than the Germans are. There wasn't anything to buy. You went into a shop and it was completely empty. This is the future that Bernie Sanders wants for you, by the way. If you were a Westerner, you had access to everything. So because you couldn't drink the water unless you, like Tchaikovsky, wanted to commit suicide, which is how he killed himself, you drank beer in the morning. So that was cool. You could get caviar whenever you wanted. That was cool. The women of Moscow, I shall say, were extremely friendly for a mere kindness. And the men of Moscow were all for sale. And I went under the Red Square for the first time and was suddenly approached by freelance hookers, black market privateers, one guy who offered to buy the jeans right off my rear end. You could get anything you wanted, literally under Lenin's tomb. So I thought again, this disparity that you see in socialism, aspirational and reality. There's no way that the left can ever make those things come together. So in the interstices here, you get the black market that flourished so much. And my impression was, there's been a war and they lost. This is almost like the old cliche about the German women saying, hey Joe, you got gum, you got a pair of stockings, good times. Anything and anybody and everything and everybody was for sale. What I particularly liked about operating in a communist country is that you could bribe people and they would stay bribed. I've always been amazed at how well the Slavs live up to the agreement of their own bribes. That you could ask somebody for a favor, give him something, and he would deliver. And that was true also all over Poland. That certainly was true there. But what I found is, again, operating in the communist country, you would essentially find your guy who you would buy, and then he would be there for you. He would drive you, he would wait for you to come out of a building, he would get you whatever it is that you wanted to get, and you could trust him to be there. It was truly amazing. And let me give you two examples of that. One day I was in the hotel room, knocked on, 9 o'clock in the morning. Opened the door, two very attractive women. I said, no, not right now, thanks. And they said, no, niet, not 6. I said, what? Caviar. Caviar? Da. And they had stolen all this caviar out of the kitchen, and they were selling it floor to floor. So I bought some. And I took it home to my children in Germany. They loved it. They all said, Dad, have you brought caviar? I said, yep, here it is. So that's how you got caviar. Another time when I was hitchhiking, guy stopped and pulled off the road, opened the trunk. I didn't know what he had in the trunk. But again, it was more caviar and vodka and stuff that he would sell me for almost nothing. And what was the unit of measurement in Russia? Does anybody know? You had the ruble. Yeah.
Cigarettes?
Marlboros. So when you got on the plane from wherever you were going, first Paris, later on Vienna or Munich or wherever I was, you would buy cartons and cartons and cartons and cartons of Marlboros. And the way it worked was, if you wanted a ride, the Soviet taxis wouldn't stop for you because the fare was too low for them to make any money. So they were rarely ever in circulation. It was too expensive. So you'd hold up a packet of Marlboros, 12 cars would stop. And you'd get in. And you'd say to the driver where you wanted to go, and he'd take you there. It was sort of like Uber before there was Uber. If you wanted other things, if you actually wanted a real taxi and you couldn't get a civilian to take you, you would hold up fingers. One, I've forgotten my Russian. Tva, yes, whatever. 1, 2, 3. That was how many packets of cigarettes you were prepared to give the guy. So 1 was the basic, 2, 3, and you'd go up for there. And eventually, the market would find its level, and you'd get a ride. But this was in a communist country. As I mentioned, the Russians didn't bathe very much, so it was kind of pungent on the famous subways in the summertime. And the gold color ameliorated some of the depression. Germany's just gray and brown. That's the only two colors they seem to know. So they do everything in gray and brown. But the Russians have this better sense. And later on, when I went to Leningrad, my impression of Leningrad is that it's blue. Uh, I don't know why that's my impression. I think standing outside, perhaps of the Winter Palace or something, you get this sense of sky that you don't get in Moscow. So far inland, it's like Pennsylvania. It's always cloudy and gray. But Leningrad, which is right on the water, on the Neva and then the Baltic, it had a much brighter and friendlier appearance. But again, the people were beaten down and dispirited. I had a conversation with a group of Russians I took out for dinner on one of my trips. And it was a very fun conversation, very lively, and multiple languages being spoken so we could all communicate with each other. And there was a woman sitting across from me. I said to her, "What do you do?" And she said, "I'm a movie director." And I said, this is before I started working in Hollywood myself, but I was interested. And I said, "Oh, that sounds great." She said, "Yeah, no, no good." I said, "What do you mean, no good, no good?" She said, "It's no good." She didn't like her job. She thought she was terrible at it. It was a chore for her to go. And this constant sense of gloom and pessimism infused the country. Now, a lot of this is just natural Slavic pessimism, which they're famous for. But the other thing was a residue of 75 years of punishment. And 75 years of living a lie, and 75 years trying to make this disparity between promise and reality work. And it could not work. And eventually, as you know, it collapsed. Incredibly predictable. So I came back from Russia the first time in 1986, and I wrote a book proposal in New York about why the Soviet Union would fall and why Germany would be reunited within 5 years. I was way wrong. Germany was reunited in 3 years. But it was turned down by every single publisher in New York with the following reasons. A, will never happen. B, it will never happen. And C, the US won't let it happen. This gets me back to my CIA guy on the plane from Paris. That, in my opinion, and I'm sure there are many here who can contradict me, the agency and the KGB effectively had a deal going. They kind of fell in love with each other. There were rules that they obeyed. There were procedures that they followed. There were agents who knew each other. And the maintenance of the status quo, the stasis, was all important. And I must say it was one of the most humiliating days for me personally as an American, even though I'm mostly an expatriate American, was watching George Bush and Secretary of State, what's the name of the lawyer who was Bush's Secretary of State? Jim Baker. Sitting there reacting to the news of the fall of the wall and showing almost no emotion. And at that point, I think I was in, where was I? Hungary, I think, somewhere around that time. And here was the end point of American foreign policy for the last half century. And the President of the United States didn't do anything. And so many of my Eastern European friends that I'd gotten to know over the course of this time were terribly disappointed in the United States. They felt that they had risked their lives, they had survived this horror, and we, at the moment of our greatest triumph, turned our backs on them and walked away. That may be an unfair assessment of Bush Senior foreign policy, but being on the ground at that time, let me tell you, it was really the sense of the meeting. A few months later, I was standing up on top of the Buda side of Budapest and with some Hungarian friends overlooking the chain bridge. It's all lit up. Even then, Hungary was a much nicer place than any of the other communist countries, and sort of gaily lit up, and husband and wife, and she was upset. I said, "What's wrong?" She says, "We are very worried that the Romanians are going to attack us." Now that seemed ridiculous. The Romanians are going to attack you? She said, "No, the nation is on alert, and we fear an invasion from Ceausescu's Romania." Now, as you know, Ceausescu soon met his end shortly thereafter at a firing squad. But they felt abandoned by the United States, and they didn't know where to turn. And again, it was such a poignant moment for me personally. Now, I went back to Germany, back and forth a lot, and my Hungarian friends, just to personalize this Cold War reminiscence, they had two little kids, and I said, "What would you guys like?" And they said, "Barbie doll." Okay. So I went back, and my children were small, and I said, "Got you guys? You got any Barbie dolls you can spare?" And of course, they had 4,000 Barbie dolls, right? So the two of them went in, and they brought me back about 12 Barbie dolls, and I took them to Budapest on my next trip and gave them to the children. And uh, again, I was disappointed in my country, and I felt like even though this is one tiny little small stupid gesture that won't matter, it does matter, and that it showed that we appreciated and honored the service that these brave people did for their country and the cause of the West. Because of course, you know, the Hungarians rose in '56 and lost a lot of people. And to this day in Hungary, where I go almost twice a year now, they talk about that a lot. And that brings me to my third anecdote, which is in the summer of '89. I mentioned this last time I was here, and I'll just give it to you briefly. As you recall, the East Germans were in Hungary. They were very limited in where they could go. This is another great thing about socialism. It tells you where you may vacation and when you may vacation. So they may vacation in Budapest, in Hungary, and most of them would go down to Balaton, this lake that's east of Budapest, and live in their little sort of beach houses there. And it was fun insofar as anything like that could be fun. But there was a rumor that went around that the East Germans were going to loosen the travel restrictions. The flashpoint of this was on the Austro-Hungarian border. Now, of course, history tells you that they were once one country. They were an empire under a monarch sitting in Vienna, but with a secondary seat in Budapest. And the cities are a couple hours apart by car now. The East Germans heard this rumor, and they began to flood into Hungary and into the embassies of third countries in smaller, or consulates rather, in like Leipzig, for example, and gathered there and stayed there, and this international crisis began to develop until finally there was a peace march or something in August of '89, and I could see all this on television. So I got in my car and I drove from Munich to the border. It's about 6 hour, 7 hour drive. And at that moment, basically, they had opened the gates, and the East Germans flooded in to Hungary. So we talk about the refugee crisis today. To the Europeans, they're thinking about that moment, which is why so many of them were welcoming of the so-called Syrian refugees. And these Germans came across in their Trabis and their Ladas and their Wartburgs, and the minute they crossed the border, they got out of their car and cried. They kissed the dirt. Yeah, I've never seen anything like it. It wasn't like Pope John Paul, who always hopped out of his plane and kissed the tarmac. No. These were whole families stuffed in these little two-cylinder cars made of plastic. And they had gotten across, and they finally tasted the fresh air of freedom. And I always thought to myself, and I made this point in a lecture I gave in Budapest last year, that the great hero of the Cold War was the unnamed Hungarian soldier who did not shoot. Could have. But the border was falling apart. The Hungarians didn't have any real money to fix it. The Russians were running out of money. This is now '89, remember. They weren't sending any more money to repair the defensive fortifications, as they called it. And finally, the Hungarians said, "The hell with it." And that opened up, and I watched those cars coming through, and I stopped, and as many people as I could, to talk to them. Not so much how do you feel, but just, here you are. And their vision of the West was so constricted. They had no idea what they were going to see. It was like going to fairy tale land, because all they had been fed was propaganda from the state television network. And the worst were the Dresdeners, because they couldn't get any Western television signal to reach as far as Dresden. And I flash back to that moment now, back to '85, when my tour ended in Leipzig, and I put my Stasi buddy on the train. I said, Victor, go home. It's freezing. We both have brand new baby daughters. Uh, I'm cool. I'm not going to assassinate anybody. Go. So I put him on the train. He left. I drove to Dresden. And I'll never forget this. He said, okay, but there's one thing I want to tell you about. The new KGB resident in Dresden is a real comer. His name is Vladimir Putin. So the night that the Semper Opera reopened on the 40th anniversary of the destruction of Dresden during World War II, durch Anglo-Amerikanische Bomben, right? There was Honecker and there was Putin. Honecker was up on a dais outside giving this address about Sternkrieger, Star Wars, and how agitated he was. And me and a buddy from the New York Times who had grown up in Berlin, was fluent in German as well, were astonished. And my friend at the Times, who's left, he said, gee, I think Star Wars is kind of baloney, but it really scares these guys, doesn't it? And in fact, it did. And in fact, it was the bluff of the poker hand that brought down Russia. So my last view of Russia was in the summer of 1991. And you could feel the steam building up in Russia. Remember, the wall fell in '89. I went to Berlin. I participated in it. I got a sledgehammer, and I have big chunks of the wall in my house up in Connecticut. But the Soviet Union staggered on for about another year and a couple of months. So I was there in the summer of '90, I guess it was. And there was that the coup against Gorbachev? Let me double check. 91, sorry. And the army mounted a coup against Gorbachev. I had just left that country, but I wasn't surprised because you could see that it was the end. That this giant edifice of nothing was collapsing. And it collapsed so fast that it caught our State Department by surprise. It caught a lot of the IC by surprise. Mac, you'll correct me if I'm wrong. It caught the world by surprise, and certainly caught the Russians by surprise. And then this whole thing fell down. And each one of these incidents in my life, 85 East Germany, 86 Moscow, and then 91 in Moscow again, and then the business at the border, was almost as if it had been a narrative written by a storyteller, because you could see it coming. Which leads me to my just concluding thought, which is, why do we fight? In the 40s, Frank Capra made a series of 7 movies called Why We Fight. And he said something that I think our foreign policy people should remember today. He said, let the enemy prove to our soldiers the enormity of his cause and the justness of ours. That by showing the enemy and naming the enemy for what he was, we could see what a monstrous cause he was defending, and that we were defending the rightness of our cause in comparison. It's a lesson that we've obviously lost today in the next big challenge against recrudescent Islam. But I think we were very clear. I think overall the Reagan and the Bush years, to a certain extent as well, had a very clear idea of who the enemy was. We win, they lose. People say, well, that was a simplistic thing. No, that was the objective. You have objectives, you have strategy, and you have tactics. The president articulated the objective, and then the IC and the American military carried out the strategy and the tactics. It was a striking and wonderful moment. It's regrettable now that it's receded and so many people have forgotten it. So I know Mac has to run, so I'm going to open the floor for questions right now to Mac. Yeah.
Anybody?
Yes, sir.
Sir, have you been to Moscow since?
No, I have never. I haven't been back since just before the coup against Gorbachev. Now it's completely different. It's completely capitalized. So I know I wouldn't recognize it. Oh, by the way, in Moscow, when you drove at night, you drove with your headlights off. I thought that was a perfect metaphor for communism. Driving around in the dark. They just used their parking lights. And also, when you parked, you took the windshield wipers off your car, so the Kazakhs wouldn't steal them. That's true. Rubber was very valuable. So every Russian driver would, in his little car, whatever he was driving, would take off the windshield wipers and lock them in the glove compartment. The whole thing was a corrupt racket from start to finish. And it finally collapsed. Yes, here we go. Question? Yeah, Jim.
So how did you ditch your tail?
Sorry again?
How did you ditch your tail?
How did I ditch my tail? Well, you never did ditch your tails in Russia. I mean, if they're not going to be visible, but they're going to keep an eye on you. They put you in the hotels they want to put you in. In our day, it was the dreaded in-tourist hotel, which is now mercifully demolished. But you assumed every room was bugged, and every woman that showed up at your door at 4 a.m. was probably up to no good. You just had to be aware of the constant monitoring and seduction of what you wanted to do. That said, I had a lot of freedom in Russia. I went all over the place and never got into any particular trouble. We used to have a joke among the correspondents. What's the worst thing they can do to us? Kick us out of the country? Ha ha. And then they arrested Nick Daniloff and put him in jail. So that kind of sobered up the reporter community pretty fast. Yeah. Carissa, what do you have to say? Well, go ahead. Pretend you did.
All right. What do you see as you've been observing Russia since then? What is the damage that you see the Soviet Union did to the Russian people as a whole, and given their demographic challenges and stuff, what do you think?
It really made them think that tomorrow would be worse than today. You'd see the public drunkenness, which was quite readily apparent, still is, I guess. And I used to say, if the Russian doesn't wake up face down in the gutter in his own vomit, he thinks, what, I didn't have a good time last night? The gloom of that woman movie director, I just have never forgotten it. She was smart and pretty and funny, and she just had no hope for the future at all. And it's so ironic then that the Democrats run on hope, which, by the way, was the last evil thing in Pandora's box. That's the only thing that didn't get out. We'd be better off, frankly, without hope than we are with it. But people often get that hope metaphor completely wrong. Hope is bad. It left them just enough hope to be completely hopeless. And it was truly an evil system. And every day you were there, no matter what creature comforts, no matter how many beers you had for breakfast, or how much free caviar you got stolen out of the kitchen, it wasn't worth it. And you felt dirty. And you really didn't drink the water. Boy, Tchaikovsky went out in a hard, painful sort of way. Any more questions? Observation? Yeah, Mac.
Being in the movie business and so forth, this recent movie, Bridge of Spies, I've seen a lot of criticism of it.
Yeah.
People say, well, it kind of portrays Abel as a heroic kind of guy, and so forth. But one of the things I noticed in it was that it didn't buy into the moral equivalency that you get in a lot of movies.
Yeah, yeah.
So I thought that was more or less a saving point of the movie, that it did make many of the what East Berlin comes across as a nasty, dirty place.
Yeah, like when he gets mugged for his coat, for example.
And,
Yeah.
And the other, of course, movie that has captured the essence of living in a police state where everybody's informing on everybody else is Lives Above,
Yeah,
which
yeah.
is a very powerful movie.
Yes, it's tremendous. Florian Henkel von Donismark is the writer-director of that movie, and he wrote that from life. I mean, that's really, Germans are busybodies. Anyway, they'll call the cops on you if you're running your washing machine at 2 a.m. Believe me, they'll call the cops on you. If you're playing loud music, cops. If you're playing anything on Sunday that penetrates outside your apartment, cops, right? That's, ja, Sonntag ist Ruhetag. Man muss Ordnung. So yeah, that comes natural to them, rat finking on their buddies. But they took it to a new level, a new art form. If you haven't seen the Leben der Andere, be sure you do, because it is an artifact of that era. And I just put in a plug for our museum in Los Angeles, which I've introduced Mac to and Dr. Linchowski later. It's called the Wende Museum, W-E-N-D-E. The word Wende in German is turning point. So the Wende is the moment when everything changed. And our genius director, then a doctoral student at Oxford, American from LA, went and started collecting all this detritus from East Germany, because it was complete chaos. I could practically dress like an East German officer. I got so much military equipment from East Germany. It'd be like Halloween every day. They were giving away their hats and their tunics and whatever else they had. We got it and we put it in a museum in Los Angeles. It's in Culver City, and It's a very small display space right now, so it's only open to the public by appointment or one day a week, but it's a great resource for scholars. If you're interested in this period, as I said to Mac, we have Eric Honecker's entire office with his hat on a peg, like he's going to come back any minute. We have complete sets of the communist newspaper. We have publications. We have the Sportsverein Fahne, the flags of these Germans love organizations, so they make sports associations for almost every sport. We have telephones, and the first time I went to the museum, I saw one of those telephones, and I said, "Hey, I used that telephone. I remember that telephone. It was in East Germany. It was in so-and-so's office." And these little plastic things. It's a great resource if you're ever in California. Please, if you're interested in the Cold War, go out and actually see the stuff. We have a bust of Ernst Telemann, who was an East German communist who was killed at, what's the name of the concentration camp near Weimar? Buchenwald, yeah. So the first time, I literally saw that bust in Buchenwald. I was in Buchenwald that summer, that winter actually. And you go to Buchenwald, and it was basically a concentration camp for Soviet prisoners. It wasn't a Vernichtungslager. It wasn't a killing camp. So we've got the bust of Telemann that stood over the site where he was actually stood up against the wall and shot. And that's now in the museum as well. So it's a great, great resource for scholars and for students, for anybody that's interested in the Cold War period. Let's take one or two more questions before we wrap up, if there are any more, or points of discussion, or anything you think I might have missed. Yeah, Jim?
It sounds like from your description, a good portion of the wall coming down the end of the Soviet Union was this sense of exhaustion, the sense that they were living a lie. It's very clear it didn't work for anybody, and they're just ready to give up on the idea.
Right.
Is there any hope that other horrible regimes or places today can see that take root, or is there sort of sense of like what that, as you said, that Venda, that tipping point is?
Yeah. Are you referring to the Trump administration?
Yeah.
National Review is...
ISIS, Syria, North Korea, any one of these. What do people just say, all right, this isn't working, enough of it?
Well, I don't think I have the one-size-fits-all answer, frankly, and the very politically incorrect answer is no, I don't think it is. Because the point I made in Devil's Pleasure Palace, which I was talking about last time I was here, is that the Western cultural underpinnings give a culture a certain life that other cultures lack. And that we move away from our foreign policy goals. The more they become lawyerized, the more they become codified, the more they become processed. What are we fighting for? That's why I mentioned Capra. Why we fight? What are we fighting for? If we're not fighting for Western civilization, not just, the right for transsexuals to use bathrooms, but fighting for Western civilization, then we don't have a foreign policy that's worth anything. It doesn't have any moral backing, and it doesn't have the belief even of its own people. So I've been advocating, as part of this book tour, a return to the basic texts and tenets of Western civilization, a return to Marcus Aurelius's principles of discovering what the nature of the thing is and what is its form and what is its function. And I really think our foreign policy establishment would be better off with more liberal arts majors in it sometimes than with the technocrats that seem to infest and barnacleize Washington, D.C. My great mission now going forward for the rest of my life in this country is to establish a kind of arts think tank, which will be similar to the think tanks I've been speaking at for the last 2 weeks, but will be about the role of culture in the body politic. And I'm hopeful to also that we'll get a sequel to Devil's Pleasure Palace, which I want to call The Fiery Angel, which will be explicitly about how culture influences politics, and in fact, history. Politics doesn't influence culture. So this is a big mission, and it's something that I hope to be telling you more about as we go forward. But we need a place that re-elevates the arts to the same level as the sciences. I'm a Sputnik baby. I remember when Sputnik went off, and all of a sudden me, who liked playing the piano and reading Dickens at age 8 or 9 or whatever I was suddenly being forced into math courses. I don't want to do math courses. I don't care about Sputnik. We sacrificed a lot of baby boomers on the altar of this sort of technocratic idea that we have to be able to compete with the Russians. We need to compete on our cultural level, not necessarily a scientific level. So I guess, yes, sir.
Yeah, what would you compare, or how would you project the post-Putin era? that we maybe?
Oh, I think it'll be Tsar Nicholas III or something like. I mean, I don't know.
So
Well,
you have it back there. So
no, I'll tell you. I'll give you an example. There's one other anecdote. I was out. There's a barge in the middle of the Moskva River across from the Kremlin called the Alexander Blok, who's a Soviet Russian poet. And one night I was there with a group of Americans, and as the Soviet Union collapsed, it became a gangster country. People began to carry firearms openly, pretty darn openly. So, and in the Russia, the gangsters were non-Slavs. They tend to be Georgians, Armenians, Azerbaijanis, particularly. And a group of them, you could always spot them a mile away. These big thuggish guys, bullet heads. And they were sitting across from us on the Alexander Block dance floor with their gorgeous, leggy, fashion model girlfriends. And they sent a couple of the girls over to ask us to dance. So I said to my Russian, American, whoever was there, friends, what are we going to do? Because the idea was if you dance with them, they'll kill you. And if you turn them down, they'll kill you. But I was watching this one big Georgian gangster. He had just very bad trigger discipline. He just had his gun stuffed in his pants and ordering champagne. And this is in the communist period. But again, this interstices, right? That's where they were operating. And you could see the gangster state coming. What Putin did was he adopted the gangsterism of the gangster state and made himself the head gangster. So it's essentially a criminal enterprise now that's running. But do the Russians have a taste for democracy? I don't think so. Nothing in their history would tell me that they do. And again, that goes back to my notion that you must know the history and the culture in order to be able to deal effectively, as we did not in the Arab world. Because we just were living a fantasy that has proven to be fallacious. So read those Marcus Aurelius texts, everybody. Thank you so much for coming. I really appreciate it.